Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 6 Part 5. It's been a long time since the last video and I've had a lot of people wondering what happened to this build. All that happened was the client wasn't ready to take delivery yet, so I had to go and work on other systems that I had other people waiting for. Now it's time to complete this build and there's still a lot of work to be done. I need to do the side panels, which involves cutting out the windows, repainting them, installing the windows. I also need to customize all of the cables. There's a lot of work to be done there. Some of the cables I'm making from scratch, the rest of them I'm cutting down to length. Everything is obviously going to be sleeved. I need to then install the power supply, do the cable management, install the lighting, the power button, and a couple of other little things. After that, I'm going to give the system a substantial factory overclock and then go through all of the test results. Now, I just wanted to quickly bring something up. Normally I don't respond to negativity at all, but I think it's just a bit of a misunderstanding this time. And it is in a lot of cases actually. There's been a lot of negative comments about the front panel mod that I did on this case, but what people don't understand is I don't have a factory in my backyard. What I mean is, what I was working with was very limited tools. I did all of it just with a Dremel. And that's something that all of you can consider. You can mod with very little, but if you have access to all of the tools and materials that you need, then there's really no limits to what you can do. But the main thing you need is creativity. Okay, I'm now working on the side panels, and the shape on the left is what I was going to go for originally. It hides the side of the motherboard tray, and I wanted to go for this shape just because it makes the side panels look a little bit more interesting. But I end up changing this coming up, you'll see why. And I just cut the side panels out fully, which I actually would rather anyway because you get to see more of the build. Now you can see that hole there, that's actually for the power button because I've removed the extra drive trays from the rear side panel, as well as the stop, power and reset button and all of the front panel connectors, because they just look bulky and ugly. All of the extra cables would make a terrible mess inside the build. All that's really necessary is a power button. So I'm now masking up the side panels, and you need to do this to protect the side panels when you're cutting. If you slip with the Dremel, you're going to put some big marks in the side panel. You still need to be very careful because you'll still very easily go through the tape, but it does protect you from minor scuffs and things. It also enables you to mark out the cuts far more easily. I mean, you can use anything to mark them out on this tape, even a ballpoint pen. So I'm now marking out the cuts. I'm going to go 30mm in from top and bottom and 40mm in from the sides. You will notice that one of my lines is actually in the perforations in this side panel, and that's exactly why I had to cut the side panels out fully and couldn't go for that other shape. Now, I did notice that the line was in the perforations, but I decided to leave it, do some cuts, have a think about what I was going to do about it, and come back to it. I've finished all the cuts, cleaned up the cuts, sanded back the panels, and I've just done the first coat of paint. What I still need to do is drill 4 holes, 1 in each corner, to attach the windows. I should really have done that before I started painting, but that's okay because I still have a number of coats of paint to do. Now there's a couple of ways of attaching a side panel window. This is the more difficult and time-consuming way. I'm not using any U-channel to cover up my cuts, which means they need to be absolutely perfect. The panels need to be repainted, obviously, to touch up the cuts. Also because around the cuts, the paint gets yellow and brown and melted. It looks terrible. You need to drill holes this way, drill holes in the window itself. The holes obviously need to line up, bit more accuracy involved there. And you need to bolt the windows on, but I much prefer the aesthetics this way. I don't like the aesthetics of U-channel. I like to be able to see the entire panel. I like to be able to see the bolt heads. There's a number of things I like about doing things this way, even though really this way takes a minimum of 3 days or so, depending on what kind of paint you use, because of the dry time for the paint. The other way takes no time at all. I mean, you can get it done within an hour because you just need to make the cuts. You can use double-sided tape to attach the windows, cover up the cuts with U-channel. Very quick and easy. There's another thing that I still need to do here. That is find a place for the power button, and actually I'm just going to mount it in the window itself, and I really don't think that's going to look too bad at all because it's a nice looking power button. I've drilled the holes and I've also finished the painting, so it's now time to cut out some windows and also drill the holes in those. I've now finished both of the side panels and I'm really happy with the way they've turned out. The size of the windows are just perfect. You can see that the curves and the cuts are perfect. All of it was done with a Dremel. I love the way the M3 button head Allen key bolts look in the corners. And you can see they just look really clean without the U-channel. The paint job is, well, I actually like it better than the stock paint job. I just think it's all spot on. Now, you can see the power button I put down in the corner here. I mounted it in the window. And I like the way that looks, considering that that is going to, light up blue. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's in a very accessible position. Where it actually will end up is right down here in this corner. So you might think you'll be able to see the side of it, but what I'm actually going to do is put some heat shrink up and over all of the connectors, and I'm going to shrink it onto the button itself, the cylinder part of it there, so none of that will be visible. It will all be covered up nicely. But anyway, there they both are. I'll just give you a quick look at the other side, how I've put them together. So you can see I just have nuts on the other side, just very simple. You don't even have to get all of these measurements absolutely perfect. If you're out by a couple of mil, in this situation it doesn't really matter. As long as you have enough overhang back here, I have approximately 10 millimeters, then that's all that matters, because the back of the side panels, it's out of sight. Okay, now moving on to the wiring. Now, a lot of people have been wondering how I'm going to do the wiring in this build. It's obviously an ITX build, it's very compact, there's nowhere to hide wiring. If you started hiding wiring in this build, which is exactly what you have to do if you use stock cables, it would be an absolute mess. So, there's only one way to do things if you want things to be clean, and that is to customize the wiring. I'm talking about cutting down cables to length, sleeving everything, making up wiring from scratch, and that's what I'm doing in this build. It's a massive amount of work, but in the end it is well worth it. Originally I was planning on going into full detail on the process of the wiring in this build, and I was going to integrate sleeving guides and all of that, but people come to my channel for water cooling, and I think if I start covering wiring, going into detail is the only way I do things. I think it's really going to bore and annoy a lot of people. I already get into a lot of trouble because I go into too much detail and talk too much, so I'm going to steer away from the process of the wiring. Instead, I'm going to focus more on the finished product. I will show you some of the more interesting moments of doing the wiring though. Now, the sleeving and heat shrink I'm using is MDPC. I have black, blue and white. I'm going to integrate the color scheme of this build into the wiring. Now, one of the blues I have here is just amazing. It matches up with the coolant and the paint job perfectly, so that works out really well. Now, what I'm going to do with the sleeving colors is the 24-pin motherboard power, 8-pin EPS and 6-pin PCIe is going to be a combination of blue and white. The SATA data is either going to be blue or white, and the rest of the wiring is going to be all black. And you can see I've actually done a lot of it already. So far I've done the wiring for the pump, the radiator fans and the lighting, and I'll just give you a little bit of an idea of the process. Now, with the existing wiring, I've cut it down to length. When you do that, you need to put new pins on, and you need to strip the end of the wire, you need to crimp the pin on, you then sleeve the wiring, put a new connector on, and then it's done. That's for existing wiring. For making up wiring from scratch, you need to have the wire. You can see I have a fair bit of wire laying around. I have 3 different gauges for all of the different wiring in a computer, 18, 22, and 26 gauge. So you basically just figure out the length, how many wires you actually need. So for example, with Molex, there might be 4 or 2. And yeah, you cut out all the wires, you strip either end, you put the pins on, you sleeve it, put the connectors on. So that's what I've been doing with all the wiring in this build. And for the pump here, there's a PWM, which I've plugged into the motherboard because that's to control the RPM of the pump, which I want to do. It's a very small loop. There's no need to have the pump running at 100% all the time. So yeah, this is a PWM controlled pump, which is excellent. It means you can set up fan profiles in your BIOS to actually control the RPM of the pump. So the other wire coming out of the pump is to power it. It's a Molex, and I've actually run that to a Molex connector that you can see here. I could have just run it straight into the power supply. This is actually the modular connector here that plugs into the back of the power supply. The reason I didn't run it straight through is because obviously I need to be able to disconnect the pump to be able to externally power it when I'm leak testing. So that's what that's about. That will just tuck in there. It will be hidden and plug straight into the power supply. Now what I'm going to do is use every single modular connector on the power supply. What I could do is use one modular connector and run power out to the pump, the lighting, the 2 SATA. I could do everything from one modular connector on the power supply, but I don't think that's the cleanest way of doing things. Instead, I'm going to use one modular connector per component. So one for the pump, one for each of the, one for the SSD, one for the hard drive, one for the fans and lighting. So I'm going to split it all up, and yeah, that's going to be the cleanest way of doing things. Now what I've done here, I've used a Phobia Molex to 6 3-pin fan splitter PCB, and not only is this for the fans, it's also for the lighting. So it's definitely the cleanest way of doing things. It was always going to be a little bit of a messy part of the build because there's so many wires coming into the one PCB. There's just really nothing I can do about that. I am inclined to cover it up with something like a piece of smoke plexi, but it's actually a completely hidden part of the build. Once the side panel goes on, you're not going to see it. It's all tucked down in the corner below, the panel that comes up from the bottom there. So yeah, I don't really have a problem with it. It's a very clean way of doing things. There's a lot of wiring there. So you can see all of that is powered by a single Molex, which goes straight back to the modular connector on the power supply. Now for a look at what I'm doing to the power supply itself. Now I have it apart because there's 2 hardwired cables, the 24-pin motherboard power and the 8-pin EPS. And I'm individually sleeving them right back to the power supply, which means I need to sleeve them inside the power supply. That's why I pulled the power supply apart. And the other thing I need to do is make the hole in the power supply bigger, because the stock sleeving, it's single sleeved. You individually sleeve all the wires, they take up a lot more space. Now here you can see a wire that's been stripped, but it hasn't had the pin put on it yet. So here's the pins. There's basically all different types of pins depending on what type of wiring it is, whether it's Molex or PCIe, whatever it is, it's different pins. And anyway, that's one that's been pinned. Okay, so the next thing I'll do after that is sleeve it and then plug it straight into the connector like that. So that's half of the 24-pin motherboard power done there. Now on this end I have put a lot more heat shrink, and this is because this is going to be inside the power supply. It's going to be out of sight, and you don't want that sleeving pulling out of the power supply. Okay, it's now time to have some fun and chop the power supply up with a Dremel. So here goes. So there it is. I've expanded that hole successfully. I didn't get any debris or iron filings inside of the power supply, which was difficult, but it's all done. I've put some new U-channel around the cut, and yeah, it's perfect. It's now time to get this power supply back together. The power supply is all finished and ready to be installed into the build. Now, before you go commenting on the lengths of my heat shrink, consider that I've just finished manipulating the lengths of the cables and untangling them inside of the power supply, so some of the pins haven't been pulled back into position. So it looks like the heat shrink isn't level, but once I pull all those pins back, it is. Also, 2 pins have popped out there. There's a blue one and a white one, so I need to go back and either bend the tabs out or replace those pins. Not a big problem at all. Now, take a look at the lengths of the wiring just here. You can see that the wiring on the bottom is shorter than the wiring on top. This is because I need to bend the wiring in the build. So not only do you have to think about that, the lengths of the wiring and the bends in the build, you also have to think about the order of the wiring as it comes out of the power supply, because it's going from a bundle, you know, in the power supply out to the connector where I've set it up in a specific order, in this case of blue and white. You can see there's a slight bulge in the power supply, but considering the trouble I had putting it back together, it's really not that much, and that should squash over time as the wire settles into position. But anyway, that's it. Time to install the power supply into the build. The power supply is now installed, but I haven't bolted it into position yet because there's still a few more cables I need to do. I need to do the 6-pin PCIe. There's 2 of those to go to the graphics card. I also need to do the SATA power and the SATA data. Once I've done those, I can plug the 6-pin PCIe and SATA power into the power supply and bolt the power supply into position. But that's it now. There's no need to remove the power supply again, so I've plugged everything else in. So I've plugged in this Molex here, which is for the lighting and the fans. I've also plugged in the pump, so that just goes around there and down, and I'll tie this up, you know, with this other cable in here and clean all that up. I haven't really pushed any of this wiring into position properly yet. I'll do all that once I do the cable management, but it sits there pretty well, and that's because of the preparation that I did inside of the power supply, getting all the cables in the right order, getting them all to the right lengths based on the curves that I needed. You can see the lengths worked out very well. This one is really short and goes straight in. Remember, the power supply is not pushed in properly yet. It still needs to go about 20 mil back this way, so that gives a bit more length. But this one worked out well. It goes up and over this tube here, so I'm really happy with the colors. You can see that the colors are just amazing. That blue is just a spot-on perfect match. I'm going to leave this part of the build log here because there's still a fair bit to cover. In the next part of the build log, I'm going to do the rest of the cables. Then I'll move on to taking a good look around the finished product, getting the system booted for the first time, and going through all of the test results. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.